Welcome to Impacting Jamaica, where we shine the spotlight on the many but often ignored positive happenings, activities, projects and investments at every level across every sector to inspire, motivate and excite people everywhere.
The mixed part of our educational achievement is that by the time we got to 2011, when there was a big assessment of education achievement across the region, we found that females who had started out in the first set of assessment just a few years after independence, who were occupying 64% to every 100 males in tertiary education, by 2011 were having a ratio of 228 females in education, in tertiary education, enrolled in tertiary education, compared to 100 males. And that explosion, which would have started with the promotion of the changes under the Roots program, Rely Unto Ourselves to Success, which would have been Michael Manley's program, fostered by the feminist movement internationally. Nobody calculated that in all of this, that black men were not in a position of advantage in the very first place. And therefore, either they needed a movement for themselves, or they needed to have been a rhetoric or some program from government or NGOs or independent international development partners we call IDP to push both groups forward.
So Doc, just so our listeners can be clear, so you are saying there's actually a flip side to the great advantage of a woman becoming educated. There's a downside to it.
I would not call it a downside. In fact, that would be unfair. For us to understand what's happening, we'd have to go back to looking at, in about 90 seconds, where the education is coming from. And even though I glossed over it, let me take you through it. So we started education with Woolmer's, secondary education with Woolmer's boys, right? Uh-huh. And Woolmer's boys would have been followed by Manning's and JC and so forth. All of those would have been in what is called the slavery epoch. And all of those were built for white boys only. Remember that Manning's became co-ed 100 and odd years later. Yeah. People need to remember that it was a boys' school. So all of those schools would have been built for white boys only, not white girls and no black people, right? Mm-hmm. And then the second epoch of education, right, what we call phase 2, would have involved, this would be the period where slavery is now abolished. Slave trade ended 1807, slavery ended 1834, and emancipation 1838. In that period, leading up to the Berlin Conference, that would be phase 2. And in phase 2, schools were now built for white girls. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then we got into phase 3, in which now you're having a clear challenge by the peasantry for education, in which schools were built now mostly for girls and not boys. So I want people to understand that leading up to independence, the ingredients were already put in the pot for males to be denied education. What happened is that the new government, as in our founding fathers, never saw what was in the pot. Okay. I am literally giving them a break in the conversation. I am saying to you, as a researcher, my first degree is in history, I cannot find the evidence that our forefathers or early fathers sat with them and created the problem.
Okay.
Because in phase 3, 10 schools were built for girls and 2 were built for boys. And that has to be a shocker. That can't be a coincidence. That can't just be an idle conspiracy theory. It must be a situation that clearly somebody was concerned So now let's look at what data we have. Here are the data we have. We know for sure that there have been expressed concern that the indentured servants that came from India and elsewhere were not sticking to the plantation. This is in the work of Malthus, Malthus, and Errol Miller, right? Mm-hmm. We know for sure that there was expressed concern in letters that scholars would have found that there is a shortage of labor on the plantation, and that there was a concern to ensure that, and M.G. Smith's work would also show some of this, to ensure that there was a large enough labor force, and this labor force was built on men. Labor force were not built on women yet, right? And therefore, it would make sense for the 5 churches that were building schools, we call them today traditional schools, right? Yeah. To have built schools for girls. We know when we got to phase 4, that the Baptists, right, would have built Calabar. We know that Bishop Gibson would have built KC. I'm giving the specific names now because these are phase 4 names, right? We know that there would have been a pushback towards building schools for both boys and girls, right? Leading, of course, into independence. So that is why I've always said education is one of the powerhouse achievements of since independence, because the damage was done before. No, I have to answer a question that whether or not you ask it, yes or no. How is it then that girls did not surpass boys until 1980, right? It's about 1981, 1982 that everybody started to see medicine and all of these eras being equal, and then by 1990 it was glaring, and by 2011 it was disastrous, right?
Right.
Now, the truth of the matter is, even if I have a space, if I have all of these schools, St. Andrew, right? I have Immaculate, the Queen's School. There are only 7 all-boys schools and 15 all-girls schools. St. Hilda's, right? I can name it, it's a whole list of 15 of them. Even though these spaces exist, they are not necessarily for black girls.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Impacting Jamaica. If you or anyone you know is involved with projects and activities that excite, motivate, and encourage, send us an email to impactingjamaica@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Do join us again for another in the series on Google Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, Podcast Addict, and Stitcher. You can also visit us at impactingjamaica.com.